And now it's our pleasure to welcome to the show Travis Reier, Bama Online senior analyst. Travis, this is a game that we knew was going to be on the schedule. I guess originally scheduled for September 26th, back when the first SEC schedule was released. And now when the redone 10-game schedule is released, it's still there. So the high-profile meeting of Alabama and Georgia, teams that played a classic with Nick Saban and Kirby Smart in the national championship, a classic in the SEC championship. It's going to be right there in Tuscaloosa. Are you feeling the energy, like as you're trying to break this game down? Does it have that heavyweight kind of feel that you would anticipate given what's happened in these last two meetings between these two teams?
Yeah, Chip, I think that part of it's still there. The anticipation of, the two teams in the SEC here in the last 4 or 5 years. Of course, LSU had something to say about that a year ago, but in terms of consistency and a presence, when you talk about both these divisions, Alabama, Georgia, that's been the storyline for much of the last 3 or 4 years, as you noted. And so I think from that perspective, it's there. It is different, though, in terms of the day-to-day buildup because of access being limited. And, but I think when you get to Thursday night, Friday morning around here in Tuscaloosa, downtown and on the Strip, it's going to have that Alabama-Georgia feel about it.
Travis, there's very few opportunities that we have to sort of view Alabama as fallible. Like typically it's just this juggernaut machine that just marches on, and then occasionally they play Clemson. Ole Miss feels like it might have exposed some fallibility in this Alabama team. Is there a feel within that building that there is that sort of vulnerability this year? Or is this maybe something that we should just, tamp down a little bit and brush off as just, hey, growing pains, weird year. Ole Miss is awesome on offense. What's the temperature there?
Yeah, Barton, I think you know this. There's a sense of urgency in any building that Nick Saban occupies, but I would think, especially after giving up a school record in total yards and the 48 points that they gave up to Ole Miss, that's been heightened this week. And you shouldn't really need any help, though, right? I mean, it's Georgia. That's probably maybe the best thing working in Nick Saban's favor. I've kind of compared it to a situation that they had back in 2014. They were sort of sandwiched around Ole Miss and Texas A&M that year. They went to Fayetteville and offensively with Lane, laid an egg, 114-13. And the next week, everybody was all over Lane. Everybody was all over this offense. Sort of a 180 from that, a reverse of that, just the defense this time around. So in matchups, as you know, they change week to week. And I thought Ole Miss between Jerry and Ely, Kenny Yeboah, the pieces that Lane has could really impact this Alabama defense, because the weakness right now is right up the middle in terms of matchups. Inside linebacker in some situations, safety in some situations. Feel good about the corners. So with George Pickens and those matchups this weekend with Patrick Surtain II and Josh Jobe, probably feel okay about that. But middle of the field, man, it's been a real weakness between bust and also just lackadaisical, lacking tackling.
How much have you scouted Georgia, even for your own analysis? Because one thing, Gary Danielson mentioned this on the Georgia-Tennessee broadcast, and it's something that I think a lot of us have noticed as well, is, Stetson Bennett loves that quick slant to the slot receiver and trying to hit, throw it on the inside. Like that would be, listening to you talk about Alabama's defense, that would be a spot where it's almost Alabama's weakness happens to fit into one of the few places where Stetson Bennett IV is comfortable moving the ball down the field through the air.
Yeah, it's absolutely right, Chip. And I posted something on the roundtable at BamaOnline.com just this morning in terms of matchups on the defensive side. And as I talked about with Barton there for a little bit, matchups change every week, maybe schematically, but once tape is out there on you and those weaknesses are sort of revealed, every team in the SEC is going to have some personnel that they can at least match that up with, even if Georgia isn't a tempo team, and the challenge that Ole Miss gave Alabama in terms of going with hurry up and tempo. You won't see that with Georgia this week, but watching Georgia against Tennessee, I expect to see actually more of Kenny McIntosh at the running back position for Georgia this week than maybe even Zamir White, because Zamir White is more along the lines of an Isaiah Spiller and a Larry Roundtree of Missouri. And if you go look at those games for Alabama, and in those situations, Dylan Moses, Christian Harris, they were fine. But you saw McIntosh a couple of times against Henry To'oTo'o, who is, we know,
awesome,
outstanding. And he really had his way in the middle of the field on some quick breaking routes out of the backfield. And there's no doubt Bennett is a guy who loves the middle of the field. If you're Alabama, you've got to try to make him beat you outside the numbers.
So why don't you kind of diagnose some of this defensive issue? You've alluded to it, and I'm curious, as you talk about what Georgia might do to attack Alabama's weaknesses, how's Alabama going to address those weaknesses? I mean, it sounds like middle of the field is kind of a weakness, but I wouldn't have – coming into the season, I wouldn't have expected a Dylan Moses, Christian Harris duo to get picked on. The safeties may be a little bit less proven. Can you sort of pinpoint what the middle of the field looks like for Alabama and maybe where they go to improve?
Well, one of the issues they've got going into this game is that Jordan Battle was ejected for targeting late in the Ole Miss game. And he's their best safety right now and their play caller back there. So they won't have Jordan Battle for the first 2 quarters either on Saturday. So, Daniel Wright has had his struggles when it comes to tackling. I know there's been talk and probably justifiably so about the missed spring practice and sort of the disruption of the college football calendar and how that's impacted not only Alabama, but you guys watch college football. You've seen it.
Sure.
Teams are really struggling just in terms of fundamentals that you would typically take for granted. But regardless, we've seen Wright in there with Battle, but then we've also seen DeMarco Hellams, a second-year player, replace Daniel Wright in a couple of games now and join Jordan Battle. But with Battle out, I think it starts this week with, who's going to call the signals back there at the safety position. Bart knows all about that, right? That's your background. So I think Daniel Wright still probably gets the go this week because he's a fourth-year junior. And when you look at the other options to kind of run the show back there, first and foremost, you got a second-year player in Hellams who's played a little bit on defense. And then you've really got freshmen. Malachi Moore is going to be a really good player. He's already starting at the nickel position. Brian Branch is going to be a really good player. But are you going to rely on those guys to make the checks and make the calls back there? So that adds to the dilemma. And, you said it. Arius Jackson in the slot. Bennett loves him. He was big last week after George Pickens. It seemed to check out a little bit. So you still got to get Moses and Harris involved in that. And then Malachi Moore is an extension, I think, at the start position against Jackson. That'll be a big matchup Saturday as well.
How does the what about that defensive staff? It seems like coming out of that game, number one, just for entertainment purposes, we've got Pete Golding taking over the Lane Kiffin position of standing still while Nick Saban circles you. And we talked about how Nick Saban doesn't yell directly at the coaches. It's more like yelling adjacent. Like, I'm going to yell this way, but it's meant for you right here. That whole defensive staff right now, what do you think's going on in those meetings, in those rooms? And do you anticipate any behind-the-scenes tweaks or changes in terms of the way that things are done during the week or even the way that things are called on game day?
Monday was sort of like a false start, Black Monday, it seemed like, for defensive coordinators in the SEC. Todd Grantham at Florida was sort of on that radar as well. Certainly Pete Golding around here. You've also got guys like Charlie Strong and Mike Stoops as defensive analysts on top of having a defensive-minded head coach, as we know, in Nick Saban. So I'm sure the suggestion box outside Pete Golding's office right now is pretty much at capacity. But I think, again, it goes back to fundamentals first and foremost. Get lined up and tackle. If Alabama does those two things better this week, I think we'll see a result at least more along the lines of what they gave up against Texas A&M. Gave up 24 to A&M in that game because the matchups and the style schematics are different. Georgia, I think, is going to help you out. Although if I was Todd Monken, I would be trying to figure out a way to get tempo as quickly as I could into my offense. But that's not really what Kirby's been about. It's not what Jeremy's really about. Not what Jimbo's about at A&M. So that could help Alabama this week.
let's stop nailing down Alabama for how bad they've been on defense, and let's talk about how good they've been on offense, because that's equally fascinating matchup, because you've got maybe the best offense in the country against maybe the best defense in the country. Maybe the best offense of Nick Saban's tenure against maybe the best defense of Kirby Smart's tenure. Where do you handicap that matchup? And I don't know, like what's your expectation for sort of who wins that just absolute good on good sort of matchup?
I think everybody's interested in the passing game aspect. You have to be. I mean, you're talking about an offense for Alabama right now, Alabama as a team is averaging 51 points per game. Mac Jones is doing some things through the first 3 games that no other quarterback in Alabama history has done, including this last guy, the last couple of years, which he established some numbers that we thought would go a long time. But, Mac coming off back-to-back 400-yard games, and we're going to talk about that all week, I know, and understandably so. But I think Najee Harris is huge in this game, and not just in terms of what he can give you on the ground, scrimmage yards, between what he can do as a receiver, what he can do as a runner. I think it needs to be that kind of week for him. And then pass protection too, because you've seen some stuff, not so much in terms of just numbers that Georgia brings, it's the way in which it goes about its 4-man pressures. You see Georgia a lot of times and you see a safety or a linebacker coming and you go, wow, they're bringing 4 guys. You just don't ever know who or where it's coming from a lot of times. So I think that's an advantage to Alabama a little bit in having a senior running back. He shouldn't get fooled too much when he's in that role as well. And Brian Robinson's another veteran that they can come off the bench with as well. But again, I understand it. I get it. I'm going to be talking about it all week too. But I'm going to be keeping an eye on Najee's scrimmage yard Saturday, because you're still going to have to get something, I think, somewhere other than just throwing it around.
There have been too many times this season where Najee Harris it is the maybe Barton. I think you might have thrown this one out here on an instant reaction podcast, but he's the kid in the youth leagues that the parents call for the birth certificate check. I mean, he should be in the NFL right now. By size, by strength, by experience, by production, he has a complete NFL resume, and yet he's in here against defenses that have been underprepared for the season because of a lack of spring and off-season, preseason, and he is absolutely manhandling them like that. That is such an interesting piece of this, because you could just rely on Najee Harris, and yet at the same time, I feel like Mac Jones, that emerging star, and the way that he's been so accurate, how good he's looked throwing the ball right now, like is there any identity shift right there that's going on? And do we see, as the tests get tougher later in the season, do you think Alabama's offense leans one way more or the other?
Yeah, I think more so than any of the previous 3 weeks, you're going to need balance. And again, it may not show up in the form of Alabama rushing for more than 150 yards, more along the lines of what you would define balance to be in the NFL these days when you talk about the running back position. I think it has to be that kind of day for Najee on Saturday night. I think that if you're Alabama, you don't want to be predictable, because I think Georgia can generate some pressure, which is the 4-man rush. And that's where Mac's intangibles and sort of his moxie, and Stetson Bennett showed some of this too for Georgia at this point. Mac doesn't sweat a whole lot when the pressure comes. He does some very subtle things in the pocket to sort of get him in position. And there's some blitz deterrence. There's some pressure deterrence in this offense. I mean, when you got hot guys like Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle running shallow crosses, that can be big plays with just a 7 or 8 yard pass. So, I think that, and for some ways too, though, it's a validation game for Mac. This is a top 5 opponent, and we all know he's played well. We know he played well last year, played well in a loss to Auburn. But I don't get into signature wins all that much. But I think with what's being said about Mac, and it rightfully so through 3 games, this is the huge stage for him. And I don't think that'll make him fret. But it is going to be a different kind of challenge, I think, this week.
We'll talk to Rusty about this, and we have, and I'm going to just sort of toss this out to you as well. Team Talent Composite came out. Georgia was number 1, Alabama number 2. All right, this is the first time Alabama's ever played a team that is more talented than them by that ranking. Georgia is sort of, they keep on getting closer and closer. Is there any feel, and I know Nick Saban would never say this, I know in the building they're never going to admit to this, or it might not even be true, but around the program, fan base, supporters, boosters, whatever you want to define it as, is there any feeling of this sort of encroaching Georgia like as the force in the SEC, and that there is some sort of referendum at hand here, whether it's this game, this year, or whatever, to sort of for Alabama to maintain that status quo in the SEC? Is there a feel that Georgia's coming, or is that overstated?
I don't think it's just Kirby. I think the expectation all along was that Kirby was going to go over there, given that program, given that location, access to premier talent, not just in the region, but we've seen Georgia, even under Mark Richt, go national in some ways. Matthew Stafford from Texas. I mean, they've always had sort of a national approach to them. No, I think, again, not just Kirby. It almost feels like Dog Day Afternoon or something, and Al Pacino's trapped in the bank, and he's got Kirby over here. He's got Jeremy now over here. He's got Jimbo down here. It's a feeling of, do these guys have him surrounded at this point? If it was just Kirby, Georgia's going to get great players. Alabama's going to get great players. Now you got to concern yourself with Jeremy up there at Tennessee. That's probably the guy that we don't talk about enough. And I thought the game Saturday showed you he's still a few horses short in comparison to Georgia. But Jeremy's going to get players too. He's doing it in this cycle. Jimbo's got access to him. And then now you've got Lane and Mississippi and Leach over there. So, that could be a concern, but at least what we're seeing right now, right, in this cycle, Alabama's still recruiting lights out.
There was a comment from Nick Saban, I think 2 weeks ago, but we're enjoying this run, the Dog Day Afternoon run of Nick Saban against his assistants. I like that a lot. I will have to credit you with that if I reference it anywhere on CBS Sports HQ or otherwise. But he had a comment that said, it was really tough for a couple years dealing with all that staff turnover, and he feels like things are solidified right now. In your eyes, just from what you've been able to pick up of the way that things are going on in that staff and in that building, do you feel like things have finally calmed down in terms of the staff turnover? And do you see those same kind of benefits either on the recruiting trail or on the field during the season in game days?
I would say continuity has showed up maybe more on the recruiting trail to this point. Guys like Carl Scott, Jeff Banks, you're seeing it in this class with Charles Huff, the running back coach. Those guys have been around a couple of years now, and I think you're seeing the fruits of that on the recruiting trail. I would say defensively, with an emphasis on that side of the ball, it's still kind of to be determined, because you had all the issues a year ago, which were largely about injuries and youth as a result, put into some tough spots. But this year you bring back Dylan Moses. Christian Harris is a year older, a year better. You had to replace some key pieces on the back end of that defense. We talk about the safety position. Well, Xavier McKinney goes on to the NFL, and Jared Maiden was a serviceable player back there. That's been a little bit of a work in progress, to say the least. But, that's where I would say we're not totally sure yet. I know he's commented here in the last week about, it feels like it's benefited the program, but defensively they still have some things to prove, and that goes back to player development too, right? I mean, we talk so much about recruiting, but the secret to the sauce under Nick Saban has always been player development. So you're kind of waiting to see that on defense at this point.
All right, Travis, I don't know what you've got coming on BOL, whether you've made public any picks yet. I don't know if we're stealing the thunder, but I'm curious if you're willing to offer up your expectations for the game. You got a pick?
Yeah, I'm going to pick Alabama. It's a tight game. I don't, obviously, with limited capacity, it's not going to be the environment. I would think that helps Georgia. Stetson Bennett making his first true road start, I guess, in this game. He's a veteran, though, kind of like a Mac Jones. And it's funny, we talk about all the talent on these two teams. Look at the two quarterbacks coming out of high school. They weren't exactly, five-star type guys, but they're in those spots. I think the matchup is a little better for Alabama defensively. I think the game slows down a little bit on that side of the ball for them this week. And defensively, I think they're better suited right now for an offense that's more about winning inches and yards again than they are maybe the explosive plays. And on the outside, with Surtain and Jobe, you have a luxury there right now that I think anyway, you can kind of take care of business and make it more about a box game, which is typically where Alabama's great.
Mm-hmm.
And this year it hasn't been as much. So they can clean up some fundamentals. I think it's a game in the low to mid-20s, which I think Georgia would be fine with. But I think Alabama just narrowly gets it done. Narrowly.
-6?
I wouldn't lay the 6.
Yeah.
No. I'm thinking something more like a field goal. I'm thinking tight. Which, if we're not going to get into special teams, but Georgia seems to have replaced Rodrigo Blankenship pretty well. And we know Alabama's history.
With missed field goals.
Will Riker stand up. Yeah.
Yeah. So many Alabama fans just sort of twitch just a little bit, just having to think about that.
They're probably in a ditch,
Yeah. He is Travis Reier. You can follow him on Twitter at Travis Reier. Go and read all of his analysis on Bama Online, BamaOnline.com, part of the 24/7 Sports Network. Travis, you're the absolute best. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.